excited to be talking to you all today. I will share my screen. So basically the way that I envision this short time that we have together going is, I put together some slides. We can talk about what is polling, how does it pertain to climate and environmental issues. We have some fun interactive activities that we can do, and then we can wrap things up by thinking about forming our own poll, and we can run our own polling questions. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. Cool. So let me just present my screen. Okay, good. You can't see any of my spoilers here. Okay, cool. Hi. Can you see like the full screen? Is that what everybody's seeing? Like the full?
We see your notes as well.
You see my notes?
Not having on the slide, it says click to add notes.
Okay, I want to make sure that you can see the full thing. It's just my second monitor sometimes says that. Okay. Let's try that again. Okay, now you should see this. Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Danielle Deisiroth. I use she, her pronouns. I am the senior climate data analyst at Data for Progress. Before Data for Progress, I worked for Senator Bernie Sanders on his presidential campaign. You can see me there pictured at the debate right before coronavirus started happening in the United States. It was great. We got to go to a bunch of debates all across the country. But before that, before Bernie, I worked as a market research and strategy consultant in Washington, D.C. So that's where I kind of got my start in the field of research. And now I'm doing it at Data for Progress for progressive causes and issues. So what is Data for Progress? So Data for Progress is a really unique, kind of entity in the ecosystem of democratic politics. We are a think tank. We are a public opinion research firm. We are a communications shop. So traditionally in politics, you have one person that does communications, one person that does your polling, one person that does your policy research, and we do it all. So we bring it all in-house. There's about 21 of us working full-time. I was employee number 10. So our organization's grown a lot in the past few years, and we've been involved in everything from getting Deb Haaland, nominated as the Secretary of the Interior, to advocating around canceling student debt, to advocating around the Green New Deal. So we have a lot of different policy areas that we work on, but climate and environmental issues is one of our biggest, and that's the one that I own. So what is polling? If you've never heard of polling before, or have maybe only seen it a few times in the news, polling is basically surveying people to understand what they think. If you've ever wondered what your neighbors might think about certain issues, well, polling is a way to help find that out. In politics, polling is mostly used to understand how are voters going to behave on election day, who's going to win the election. What types of trends and shifts are happening among voters? Are they becoming more aware of certain issues? Are they caring less about certain issues? And especially related to campaigning, what types of messages are resonating with voters? Like, do suburban women particularly like seeing, campaign ads about, protecting their children's air and water, that sort of thing. So polling can be used for a lot more than just telling you who's going to win on the election day. So I thought we could start off with a little interactive game. Can anyone guess what they think the percent of American adults who think global warming is happening? Anyone want to guess? Put it in the chat or say it aloud. Go for
like 70, yeah, or so.
75%. Okay, that's a pretty good guess. Let's see. 72%. Wow. I know you're in high school. Maybe you should go to Las Vegas in a few years. Pretty close. So let's try another one. What percent of American adults think that global warming is mostly caused by human activities? Not that it's just happening, but if it's caused by humans. What do we think? 55%. Okay. The moment of truth. 57%. Okay, wow, you are very close. You're right on the money here. So as you can see, that's a really big difference. Before, yeah, people acknowledge that global warming is happening, but this is where we start to see where polling can be really useful, because how you word the question and what you're specifically asking about can be a totally different thing, right? Like this is like a 15-point difference between, yes, I acknowledge that global warming is happening, and I think global warming is caused by human activities. So really big difference there. Now, what percent of American adults do you think Congress should do something to address global warming? What do we think that might be? Okay, 45%, so a bit lower. Okay, let's see. So actually that number is around 60%, right? That's like a little surprising. And this is where the data starts to get really interesting. Like, okay, people acknowledge that global warming is happening. Only about half of people think it's caused by humans, but now we see another bump up again. So 60% of people think Congress should do something about it. And think about it. Say you're a farmer in Iowa and you acknowledge that global warming is happening, but you don't think it's caused by humans. You still want Congress to do something about it because your crops are going to die if the climate keeps changing. So there's definitely still more of a national appetite for acting on climate. And this number is only increasing over time, and especially in recent months. So I have just two more, but we'll bring it back home to California. What percent of adults in California do you think that Congress should do more to address global warming? What do we think? 85. Yeah, California is a pretty liberal state. You might think it's pretty high. So actually, that number is only about 64%. Which is just 4 points above the national average. So, I was originally surprised when I saw this too, because I thought that California would be maybe in like the high 60s or low 70s. But it's only just 4 points above the national average. Now for my last question, what percent of adults in the Bay Area do you think that Congress should do more to address global warming? Okay, high number again. Yeah, you're really close. It's 71% in the Bay Area. So as you can see, California is a huge state. There's a lot of, though it typically votes for Democrats in elections by a significant amount, there's still different ideological pockets within California. In the Bay Area, especially, as you can see, people really want Congress to take action on climate change. So I thought that would be a fun way to kind of kick us off and just show that, the way that you ask questions matters when you're a pollster, and the way where you're doing your sampling matters too, because if you're looking at the whole country versus a state or even a city, those results can vary pretty significantly. So a little brief history of polling. I won't bore you too much. Pennsylvania was the birthplace of me and political polling. The Harrisburg Pennsylvanian conducted a straw poll in 1824. They literally were drawing straw, and Andrew Jackson led 70% over Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. But then the election went to the House of Representatives, which elected John Adams. So things didn't really go according to plan. But my favorite historical example of a poll that is still relevant today is the Literary Digest versus Gallup. In 1936, this was around the time of FDR, the Literary Digest mailed a poll to 10 million readers, and they predicted that FDR would lose to the Republican candidate by a pretty significant amount. They only thought FDR would get around 40% of the vote. In the end, Roosevelt won with over 50% of the vote. So that's like a 9-point difference. That's pretty significant. And remember, this was during the Great Depression, so magazine subscriptions were expensive, and the sample skewed very wealthy and Republican, hence why people thought that Roosevelt was going to lose. But then this guy named George Gallup from Iowa had a different idea. He sampled 50,000 voters, so a way smaller sample size compared to 10 million, 50,000, much, much smaller. But what Gallup did that was better was he worked out the type of personal characteristics, like what state people lived in, where do they live? Do they live in urban areas? Do they live in rural areas? How old are they? What's their gender? And so he established basically what we do today, like survey sample quotas. And he predicted that Roosevelt would win with 56% of the vote. It was really close to the final total and much better than the Literary Digest poll. There are still some traditional polls. The Iowa State Fair does a kernel poll. It's not 100% accurate because, as you can see here in 2019, the results were a bit different. That of the poll were a lot different than what actually happened in the caucus. But there are still some fun, kind of traditional polling things that happen in the world today. But real polls, they're no longer conducted by kernels or drawing straw. There's kind of three main ways that people take polls. It's via landline, so calling people on the phone. I don't know how many of you have a landline phone in your household. I know my mom still does, but this is kind of becoming a way of the past because a lot of people our age, well, y'all are in high school, so you're a little younger than me, but most people that are millennials or Gen Z don't have landlines. And so we, as posters, have to reach voters where they are. So at Data for Progress, we conduct our polls using web panels, which is symbolized by Bernie Sanders, and text message, which is symbolized by Hillary Clinton. So this is a text message in particular is a really innovative way to reach people to take polls, because think about how much time we all spend on our phones, right? And when you register to vote, you hand over information, including your cell phone number, that is available in the voter file. So you can reach people and where they are, and that we find is why we're more accurate than a lot of pollsters that just use landlines, because we're actually reaching people and not just talking to a skewed subset of people who only have landlines. So here are some of the other major pollsters out there today. If you watch the news or read, any newspapers online, you probably have seen some of these names before, like Morning Consult, or Gallup is still around today. They have like the most historical rich data set. It's amazing. Pew is another great kind of stalwart that's been around for decades, and they have such a depth of information. The Yale program on climate change, which is where I got the data from at the beginning of the survey, also has, a decade plus worth of data specifically pertaining to climate change, which is really awesome. But you'll probably see a lot of these names on the screen floated around during newscasts if they're talking about polling. But there's also models. So what is modeling? Wait, there's polls, there's models, there's so much data. So this became, I think, especially prevalent during the 2016 election. But there's a couple of modelers out there like 538, the New York Times Upshot, The Economist. What they basically do is they take in a bunch of polls and they run scenarios to assess how the election might turn out. So if you are kind of an election nerd like I am, in the weeks leading up to the 2020 election, I was constantly going on 538, constantly looking at the New York Times to see what the models were saying. As soon as a new poll would come out, they would basically feed it into the model and see what was going to happen. And, there's some scientific factors that they use to make these models, like polls and previous election turnout numbers. But there are others, like secret ingredients to making these models, that I am not really sure of. And honestly, I think it is people just going with their gut. And that's something you'll find in polling a lot, is that for as much data science as we do, sometimes things just happen and we go with it because our gut says we have to do it. And oftentimes those people are right. So that's kind of a fun thing about polling. So how to interpret a model, like I just said, this is what the 538 looked like right before the 2016 election. And a lot of people after the 2016 election were like, oh my God, it only said that he had like a 20% chance of winning. How could this happen? Well, that's still a statistical outcome, and it was still a chance. So the way that you, I think, interpret a model is to look, you just have to take those sometimes with a grain of salt, but also realize that, both scenarios can happen and the model predicts that. So good food for thought. So I thought we could take another break now. I know I've been talking at you for a while, and I thought we could talk about reading, how to read a poll. So this is a poll that I ran earlier this year. It has a pretty big sample size of about 3,000 voters. So that's a lot of people. Usually our national polls have only around 1,000 to 1,200 participants. So we can actually look here at the demographic breakdown of different respondents. So I was wondering if you all, take a look at this, soak it all up. And I would love to hear if anybody has some thoughts about what's kind of interesting about this, if there's anything that's surprising about this data, or is there anything that you're, maybe thought you would see, but you don't hear?
Sorry, is my okay, yeah. Well, thank you for sharing all of this. I think we at BCS really appreciate it. But I did want to ask, like, isn't there like a geographic distribution here? Like, I noticed that they just how do I say this? Like, I don't see it really like separated by region, like the West Coast or the East Coast. So why is
Yeah. So a lot of people in political polling, especially, care for national surveys. This is nationally representative of the electorate. So when we're actually fielding a survey, we have certain quotas for types of zip codes and states. So we're making sure that we're collecting a sample that's representative of the American electorate. But most people just care, honestly, what the partisanship breakdown is. I think a lot of our national conversation and the way that polling is used is saying, well, this has bipartisan support. So I sometimes, sometimes we don't even send over the full crosstabs. We'll just send over the breakdown between Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. And like a great example of where geographical polling is helpful is a few weeks ago, I did a poll with the National Wildlife Federation, which is a big conservation group. And we were asking about conservation practices. So we broke out the survey responses by region in America, and we found that people in the West, so we have, the 6 or so states that we deem the West for our breakouts, were much more supportive of conservation policies than people in other regions, which was really interesting because obviously people out West have experience way more wildfires, earthquakes than, a lot of folks in the rest of the country have. So that's one example of where we would typically show geographical breakdown. But to answer your question in a very long-winded way, most people don't really care that much.
sorry, okay, thank you for that.
What I thought was interesting about this poll was that Democrats, Independents, and Republicans all support creating good jobs and clean energy. So sometimes I see, Independents and Republicans support things a bit less. And this was a very generously phrased question. By that, I mean, who doesn't support creating jobs? It's kind of like the example I pointed to earlier. It matters what type of question that you ask. But still, this is something that shows, there's general sentiment, regardless of what people think about climate change, people support creating good jobs and clean energy. So that was like my big takeaway from this poll. Anyone else have any last thoughts before we move on?
It's interesting to see that there's like an amount just in general of people who just voted, I don't know. Because it's a very specific question.
Yeah, so the don't know is really, I think, interesting too, because typically, if we're asking about a really niche policy, like, do you support or oppose tax credits for manufacturing or something that like most people don't know or care that much about, the don't know percentage is higher. Like it might be somewhere between like 10 to 20%. I've even asked some questions about some really kind of out there policies that have a don't know almost as high as 30%. And then that's a note to me as the pollster that I did not write a good question. If almost a third of my sample, this happened once, did not know what I was asking about, I got to go back to the drawing board and figure out a way to ask this in a way that more people are going to understand. So I think that's kind of one of the hardest parts of my job, especially being a climate change pollster, is to ask questions in a fair and balanced way and make sure that people understand what I'm saying. because I can hear a word and, automatically assume that someone knows what like a subsidy is, for example, like if I'm asking about subsidies for fossil fuel companies, but then I have to go back and be like, wait a second, what am I really asking about? Am I asking about the government giving tax breaks to oil and gas companies, some way to like explain it more so that everybody can understand? A good rule of thumb for me is that if a sixth grader can't really understand it or an eighth grader, then I got to go back to the drawing board. Well, cool. Okay, so let's move on to the next little bit here. So if any of you noticed, in 2020, the polling was off a little bit, just as it was in 2016. And there seemed to be a systemic error again, especially in state level polling. So in Senate races, like in Maine and in Iowa, Democrats were projected to win. Maine, I think especially, was the biggest case of this. When the ballots were still being counted, it seemed like the polling was a lot worse than it actually was. But, when it was done, the margin of error of the polling was a little bit less than, what we kind of feared it was on election night, but still it was off. So let's take a look at Iowa as a case study. And I know I've used Iowa quite a few times in this example, but I actually lived in Iowa for 6 months during 2019 and 2020. So it has a very close place to my heart, especially as a part of our political process. What happened in Iowa? Let's look at this. This was the 538 model here. Or I think this was 538. They predicted that Greenfield, who was the Democratic candidate, had a slight edge over Joni Ernst, who was the Republican candidate. A lot of folks had her up +1, +3, +4, but wait, if you look at this first one, Seltzer and company, they have Ernst +4. And I remember when this poll came out, because Ann Seltzer is like a god in the polling world. Like, she is everything. She is the most accurate pollster. This woman knows how to poll Iowa. And when she said that Ernst was going to win by 4, a lot of people were freaking out, being like, oh my God, is the same thing happening like what happened in 2016, where we thought we had such a big edge because of the polling, and then election day happens and we like lose. And kind of the same thing happened in 2020, because a lot of people were predicting the Democrats would win even more seats in the House of Representatives, predicting we would win more Senate seats. And then Biden barely won the presidency, and it carried it over by like 40,000 votes in a couple of states. So it was a lot closer than I think a lot of pollsters predicted. And Ann Seltzer got it right. And I want to know what she does, because she's a really good pollster. So yeah, this is my little side fangirling about Ann Seltzer. A lot of people called her an outlier and just were like hand wavy and said, oh, this is just one poll. Everything else is, looking really good for the Democrats. But she was right. And Ann Seltzer actually also correctly polled the 2020 Iowa caucus as well. She predicted that it would be Bernie and Buttigieg basically neck and neck at the top. And that's exactly how it was. So she might be the new Gallup. So what's next for us in the polling world is we're still figuring out what went wrong with the polls in 2020. We're starting to pull ahead for the midterms, which is in 2022, which is like a very big thing. So we're trying to get everything right heading into the midterms, but it's really interesting, and I'm like endlessly fascinated because the electorate changes so much. Like, it depends on who's in power, who's not in power. Things like social trust, understanding who is taking our polls and who is not taking our polls. So what happened to a lot of pollsters in 2020 was that a lot of Donald Trump supporters were not taking polls because they did not want to take them. I personally would text out links to take polls, and I'd get a lot of responses back that would just say like MAGA, like F you, like really mean things sometimes. It wasn't great. But those people were less likely to take our polls, but very likely to vote for Donald Trump if they were sending back like F you, go Donald Trump. But we weren't capturing those in our polls. So, but now it's really interesting that we're polling some states for special elections next month, like Virginia, And we're actually seeing more Republicans engaged in our polls, like way more than they were in 2020. So it really depends. Like if a Democrat is in power, maybe Republicans are going to start getting more involved. And the same thing happened when Donald Trump was in power and more Democrats got involved. And we saw the blue wave that happened in 2018. So to the best of our ability to predict for those types of changes in voter behavior, that's what we're focusing on, as well as, not treating certain ethnic groups and geographies like a monolith. For example, Hispanic voters. If you look at Texas in particular, Hispanics in the Rio Grande Valley voted very differently than, Latino and Hispanic voters in different parts of the state. So it's important as pollsters that we reach those voters and we understand that there are different, there are vastly different opinions even within certain demographic groups, and also sampling more rural voters as well. They're definitely harder and harder to reach, given that fewer pollsters are doing landlines and we're focused mostly on text message and web. So really getting innovative. We actually have started experimenting with even doing polls in the mail, kind of a throwback to the 1930s, but turns out reaching people via mail is a really great way to get folks who are typically less engaged in taking traditional polls. So I think it's exciting that we're readjusting how we're operating and going forward. Definitely it's very high stakes, but it's very cool. So now for our last activity, I think we have like 10 minutes or so left. I thought we could write a couple of polling questions, maybe come up with 3 polling questions together as a group, and then Data for Progress can put these questions on an upcoming survey and we can actually see what the results are nationwide. So if that sounds good to people, maybe we can brainstorm some ideas about what you all want to ask voters about. What's on your minds? What are you thinking? All right. Who wants to go first? Amelia, do you have an idea?
I was curious about how many people support the operation of line 3, since I know that's been a big thing in the news lately. So maybe we could ask, like, which comes closest to your opinion? Like, strongly support, somewhat support, somewhat like oppose, and then strongly oppose. I don't know.
I'm going to start a Google Doc and share my screen so we can do this in real time. Okay. 1 second. Okay. So I will start jotting down some ideas and then we can work on the wording and once we kind of have our main idea. So I like the idea of line 3. This is definitely something I've been hearing a lot of people asking about too. So really great idea. Who's next? You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
I think one that we should maybe include would be that how can BIPOC people be more represented, because we're not really represented as much as we can be or should be.
You mean like in the climate movement at large, or
Like just well, specifically, I think that a lot of people of color, sometimes I think that we're kind of shadow. Like, it's nothing against anyone, but for some reason the construct is just like that. They usually, if we do something the same as someone else, then they'll usually overshadow us. And I think that maybe we can ask about how we can stop that.
Okay, so we can maybe ask a question about how can we improve inclusion of typically or traditionally marginalized groups. Maybe let's think about it, like focusing it a little bit more specifically on maybe like one type of like sector of life. So, maybe do we want to think about like education or like professional opportunities, like the workplace? Is there anyone that you're particularly passionate about?
I want to be an architect, so maybe one could be how can architects and engineers find more sustainable materials to use in their everyday buildings and
Okay,
even bigger projects like skyscrapers?
okay.
Amelia, how was it phrased in the intro? They had like one of the questions that was about inclusion. Do you remember how it was phrased?
Oh, yeah, I can go look. Hold on. Also, I just put one in the chat. Oh, wait, never mind. You got that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the areas that we've been kind of working on in the background is with some of the folks who are doing the activism on corporate boards, and climate finance is like a very big thing that we're interested in exploring. Does anybody else have any other ideas? If not, we can get started into writing these into questions. Government regulation of industry benefits society.
I'm just putting the questions. Our keynote speaker had some questions, so I'm putting them in the chat. Feline, I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
Oh, I think it was just like who was Dominic, I think, was talking about like the wait, maybe I misunderstood. I don't know.
Yeah, I spoke about inclusion, yeah, of marginalized people.
Okay, well, I think we have a lot to run off of here. So let's try and narrow it down here to 3. So I think does anybody have, well, it's so hard to narrow it down though, because they're all such good questions. So let's start from the top. We'll start with line 3. I think that's a good example to start with, because line 3 is something that maybe a lot of people haven't heard of before. So maybe we could say something like, line 3 is a new proposed oil pipe, or it's a tar sands pipeline, yeah. Pipeline that would bring fossil fuel products from Canada to America. Do you support or oppose the construction of this pipeline? Does that sound about right to you, Amelia? You're probably more involved in line 3 activism than I am.
I think it's actually like operational right now, so it's not like it's in the proposed stages really anymore.
We actually might want to say, so this is where something I think might be interesting to say, like some say that we should, that President Biden, because we want the president to do this, right? Some say that President Biden should shut down line 3 because it causes pollution and it infringes on the lands and waters of indigenous peoples.
I have a
And
question.
we can say, so this is one type of question that we ask where it's kind of like a pro-con. And this is really helpful for, types of like current events or policies that people might not know that much about. Because think about it, public opinion doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not like I just like lock you in a room where you don't have access to a radio or a television. Like the average voter is hearing things from both sides. So what we find a lot of the times is that when we give people pro and con arguments, we actually see that helps them, A, actually understand what the heck is going on, but B, it provides a more realistic expectation of what people actually think, right? Like at the question I showed you earlier about people supporting investments in green jobs, great, like 70% of people say they support that. But I bet if I put a line in there saying some people don't support these investments because they say that it's going to get rid of jobs in the fossil fuel industry, then that result probably would have looked a lot different. So, it all kind of ties back to that beginning about it really matters what type of question that you ask, because that your result is going to depend on what you ask. So sorry for that little tirade there, but so some people think we should shut it down. Others say that we should keep it open because it will bring cheap energy to America, create jobs.
You ever get
Support or
like
oppose
vastly different answers if you include a name?
using the line 3? What do we think about that? Oh, Giovanni, do you have a question? You can go ahead and unmute.
Yeah. Sorry. Someone. Okay. Oh yeah. So is line 3 supposed to be a congressional, or is it like an executive issue? Like, who would be subject to veto it? Would it be like Congress or the president?
I think it'd be up to the president.
Okay.
Sorry, I also realized that my computer was muted, so I'm really sorry if I missed your question. Sorry. Does someone else have a question? You can just go ahead and unmute yourself.
I think that maybe the architecture and the sustainable buildings one, maybe we can change it to do you support sustainable, do you support making urbanization sustainable?
Okay. Maybe we could frame that in the context of like what the government can do. So maybe you say something around do you support or oppose the US government investing in sustainable green or sustainable building materials? Does that sound good?
I was thinking more like investing in well, I think that's a good idea actually. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, so that's one way that we can maybe even ask about this, and one thing that the government is actually doing right now that's exactly pertaining to this policy is that they're using the federal procurement process to purchase green building materials. So we could even put it in the context of that, since that's something that the government is considering doing. Say the federal government uses a process called procurement. Whoops, spelled that wrong. To purchase government materials. Do you support or oppose the US government using the procurement process to purchase sustainable building materials? There we go. That's something that we can ask about, something that the government's already doing or considering doing. And yeah. And then again, just adding a little bit of context, because most people probably don't know or care about the federal procurement process. I unfortunately know too much about it and care too much about it. All right, so I think that's 2 questions, and then maybe we have room for one more. About marine protected areas. I saw your comment there, Amelia. That is a good one. I think maybe let's do a question, because we're doing 2 kind of like, we did like one current event question, one policy question. Why don't we do one like personal question? So I really like this one about, does climate change disproportionately impact a community that you're part of? I think that's a really good question. And a way that we might even want to think about this is about not just climate change, but air pollution, water pollution, those sort of effects of climate change that we know that maybe the average voter isn't connecting right now to climate change explicitly, but they still know that it's existing. So why don't we ask a question? This is a different type of question, kind of like basically, you know how you get a homework question, it's like 1A through D, but it's actually all like one question. That's a type of question that we can ask here, where it's basically kind of like multiple questions baked into one. So why don't we do this type of question? Say, has climate change impacted any of the following? And then we can ask them a couple of things. Has it impacted you personally? A community that you are a part of? A community in your city, but that you are not a part of, right? Because so many of us might be seeing something happen to a community that's across the other side of town from us, but we aren't personally affected. Or we could ask something about someone in your life that does not live in the same system. Because many of us might have relatives or friends that have been impacted by climate change in a different part of the country. So I think this could be a great option for kind of our last question. So, it forces people to kind of reflect on different aspects of their life and how climate change is affecting them. Cool. Well, I think those are awesome ideas, and I can work on, getting these questions and on a survey that we're going to run recently, and then I can get in contact with Amelia, or I don't know if there's a better way for me all to get in contact with you, but I can share the results of our experiment that we developed together today, if that would be interesting to people.
Thank you. That would be
Thank you.
amazing. And I captured who was here, so I can definitely send those out via email.
Cool. Well, does anybody have any last questions before we go?
I do have one question.
Yeah.
Do you ever get like vastly different results if you include a name? Like we included President Biden. Would someone just see that and automatically like not care about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And sometimes we do. I think it really depends on the context. Like if we're specifically asking about something that President Biden can do, like we should definitely name him. I think it's more interesting when thinking about climate change, because so often if I'm asking a question and I specifically say the words climate change, a lot of Republicans will maybe not support a policy, whereas if we just use a generic term like clean energy or air and water pollution, then you don't see the same polarization across different partisan groups. So, being a climate pollster in particular is like part of my job is figuring out like, okay, aside from, how do we get people on our side that may not agree with the science of climate change? How can we still talk to them and like get them to support making addressing climate change, whether that's maybe phrasing it in a way that's like, we're creating new jobs in clean energy, or we're going to clean up the air and water in your community. Those we typically find are like more approachable ways for people who might be more skeptical about climate change.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, was machine learning used in the past for the polling, or is like the advent of machine learning like a relatively new phenomenon in polling?
It's definitely a new phenomenon. Machine learning is there's one Democratic data scientist in particular who his name's David Shore, and he's kind of like the pioneer of using machine learning in model building. So it's definitely, I would say, in the past like 5 years really taken off, but it's been around. It started around like 2012 for the re-election of President Obama. So it's definitely still pretty nascent, and I candidly don't know that much about it. We have a lot of people on our team who are much better at it and actually are like brilliant data scientists that can do that type of stuff, but I think it's cool. It's definitely like an emerging factor of everything.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like y'all are doing a phone banking session. That's awesome. Thank you for coming to my presentation. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And I'll drop my email in the chat if you all have any questions that come up later. Feel free to reach out to me.